The first time I held someone's hand as they died, I felt completely calm. I felt certain. I felt like I had finally found the thing I was put on this earth to do. My name is Miriam. I am a death doula. I know. I know what just happened in your mind when you heard that. There's this little flicker. Death doula. And people either lean forward or they lean away. There is no in between. I've been watching that reaction happen at dinner tables and school gates for the better part of 8 years now, and I still find it fascinating. Because the thing is, I didn't start out as someone who leaned forward. I spent most of my life being the person who changed the subject, who left the room, who busied themselves with the washing up the moment death came anywhere near the conversation. I was a secondary school English teacher for 11 years. Before that, I was a daughter, a sister, a friend, ordinary things in an ordinary life in Shrewsbury. I had a cat called Gerald, a slightly disastrous subscription to a meal kit service that I never canceled, and a very strong opinion about the correct way to make a pot of tea. I was not, by any stretch of anyone's imagination, the person who was going to end up sitting with dying strangers for a living. But let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. My mom was diagnosed with ovarian cancer when I was 31, stage 3. The doctors were cautious but not hopeless, and my family I mean, we did what a lot of families do. We did the thing where you rally round and you are relentlessly, exhaustingly optimistic. We talked about treatment plans and percentages and clinical trials. We brought her smoothies she didn't want and books she couldn't concentrate on. We filled every silence with something because silence felt dangerous. Silence felt like surrender. She was ill for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days. I counted afterwards. I don't know why, but I counted. The thing nobody tells you, and I mean nobody, not the consultants, not the specialist nurses, not the well-meaning friends who have been through it themselves, is how profoundly alone you feel in those final weeks. Not because people aren't there, people were everywhere. The house was full of people, casseroles on the counter, cards on the windowsill, but there was this gulf between what was actually happening and what anyone was willing to say out loud. We were watching my mother die, and we were all pretending, right up until the very end, that we weren't. She died on a Tuesday morning in February. It was raining. I remember that specifically, not because it felt poetic or symbolic, but because the rain was loud on the hospital window, and I remember thinking it was rude, that it was the wrong kind of noise for what was happening. She died, and nobody, not one person in that room, knew what to do next. We stood there, the three of us, me and my brother Daniel and my dad, and we just looked at each other, completely lost, completely unprepared. That feeling stayed with me for a very long time. I went back to teaching, I marked essays, I attended parents' evenings, I did all the things you do when you're functioning on the outside, but quietly falling apart on the inside. I had grief counseling, good grief counseling. I want to say that, it helped. But there was still this specific thing, this specific wound that I couldn't get to. It was the unpreparedness of it all, the sense that we had been failed, not by the medical staff who were caring and competent, but by the culture. By this enormous collective conspiracy we have to pretend death isn't coming until it's already standing in the room with you. I stumbled across the term death doula on a podcast, one of those 3 a.m, can't sleep, rabbit hole situations that I'm sure many of you know well. I listened to this woman talk about her work, and I sat up in bed and I thought, that is the gap. That is exactly the gap that swallowed my family whole. Sometimes called an end-of-life doula or death midwife, is a non-medical support person who guides individuals and their families through the dying process. We don't replace doctors or nurses. We sit alongside them. We handle the things medicine doesn't have time for: the emotional preparation, the practical wishes, the unfinished conversations, the terrifying silences that nobody else knows how to sit in. I trained for 18 months. It was the most difficult and the most important thing I have ever done. And then, at 38 years old, I started my practice. The first family I worked with independently, not in training but on my own, was a man named Robert. He was 67 years old, retired geography teacher, absolutely hilarious man, dry as a bone. He'd been diagnosed with motor neurone disease, and by the time he came to me through a referral, he had about 8 weeks left. His wife, Carol, was the one who made contact. She rang me and she said, I'll never forget this. She said, I don't know what I need, but I know I need something. That's the most common sentence I hear. I don't know what I need, but I know I need something. Robert was still sharp as a tack mentally. That's one of the particular cruelties of MND. The mind remains completely present while the body systematically closes down. He knew exactly what was happening to him, and he had decided, quite fiercely actually, that he was going to do it his way. He wanted his death to be organized. He wanted a playlist. He wanted people to stop looking at him with that face. You know the face. The slightly tilted head, the softened eyes. He called it the vicar face, and he had absolutely no time for it. My job in those 8 weeks was many things. I helped him write an ethical will, not a legal document, but a letter to his children and grandchildren about his values, his regrets, his hopes for them. I sat with Carol while she talked about her terror at being alone in the house afterwards, the purely practical terror, not just the grief. Who would check the boiler? Who would do the tax return? These are real fears. These are the fears that get dismissed because they sound small next to the enormity of loss, but they are not small to the person inside them. And I helped Robert have a conversation with his son Michael that they had both been avoiding for about 15 years. I'm not going to tell you the details of that conversation because it isn't mine to share, but I will tell you that it happened, and that Robert died 6 weeks later with that thing resolved. That is the work. But here's the part that people don't expect. When I say people, I mean the families I work with, and honestly, I mean me too, in those early years. The emotional weight of this job is not what you think it is. People assume I must be hardened. They assume I must be operating at some clinical remove, some professional distance. And when they discover that isn't true, that I cry, that I grieve, that there are clients I think about for years after, they don't know what to do with that information. There was a woman I'll call Agnes. She was 44 years old. Breast cancer, aggressive, secondary spread. She had 2 teenage daughters, 15 and 17. I worked with Agnes for 4 months, and I want to tell you that those 4 months were some of the most intimate, most difficult, most profound of my life. Agnes was angry. She had every right to be angry. She was 44. She had things to do. She had daughters to raise. And part of my job, a part that nobody glamorizes, nobody talks about on the Instagram posts about death positivity, was to sit in that anger with her. Not fix it, not reframe it into something more comfortable, just be in it. There was a day, about 6 weeks before she died, when she asked me to help her record voice messages for her daughters. For birthdays they would have without her, for graduations, for the day one of them might get engaged or become a mother herself. We did this over 2 sessions because the first session, we couldn't get through it. We sat on her bed, she was mostly in bed by then, and she started speaking to her daughter's future wedding day, and she broke down, and I broke down, and we just held each other for a while. I'm not ashamed of that. I want to say that clearly. For a long time, I thought that my emotions were a liability in this work. Now I understand they are the credential. The system failures are real. I need to talk about those because they're important and because I have watched them damage families in ways that could have been prevented. There is still an enormous postcode lottery when it comes to palliative care in this country. The care itself, from the NHS teams and the hospices, is often extraordinary. I want to honor that. But the preparation for death, the psychological and practical scaffolding that families desperately need, is largely invisible on the NHS. It falls into a gap. GPs don't have the time. Specialist nurses are stretched to the absolute limit. And so families arrive at the moment of death with no roadmap, no vocabulary, no framework for any of it. I have met families who didn't know that they were allowed to ask what the dying process would look, sound, or feel like, who sat through the final hours in panic because no one had told them that the breathing changes, that there will be a rattle, that the hands and feet go cold before anything else. Information that costs nothing to give. Silence that costs everything. I charged Robert and Carol on a sliding scale. I do this for most of my clients because the idea that end-of-life support should be a luxury for the affluent genuinely makes me furious. Agnes's family I worked with at a significantly reduced rate. I'm not telling you this to congratulate myself. I'm telling you because the economics of this field are a scandal, and the fact that families can access a death doula is largely a matter of knowing the right people or being in the right postcode, and that is wrong. I have had GPs refer to what I do as hand-holding. I have had a hospital consultant once tell a family in front of me that they didn't need a doula. He was a good doctor, that man. Kind, I think. But he genuinely could not see the gap he was standing in. I am 46 now. I have sat with, by my count, over 90 individuals in their final months, weeks, and hours. I have held hands at the moment of last breath. I have helped families write eulogies, sort through belongings, and navigate the bizarre administrative machinery that cranks into gear the moment someone dies, and which nobody warned them about. I have made so many pots of tea that I've lost count entirely, and I stand by the opinion that the correct brewing time is 4 minutes minimum, and if you fish the bag out before that, you are a coward. I still think about Robert's laugh. I still think about Agnes's daughters, who are young women now, and I genuinely hope, that somewhere they have those recordings, and that they've listened to them, and that their mom's voice is still with them somehow. I think about a 91-year-old woman named Iris, who died in April last year, who spent her final week asking me to read her P.G. Wodehouse aloud, and who told me on what turned out to be her last fully conscious day that she had had a thoroughly decent innings, and that she wasn't a bit frightened. Not a bit. That stays with you. That kind of grace stays with you. I am not a morbid person. I want to be clear about that. I find life, specifically because of this work, more vivid than I ever did when I was avoiding the conversation about death. Every ordinary Tuesday feels more like a gift. Every cup of tea, properly brewed. Every boring, beloved, unremarkable Wednesday afternoon. Death is not the opposite of life. It is the thing that gives life its shape. My mom died not knowing that her daughter would spend the rest of her working life making sure other families got what we didn't have. I don't know what she would make of it, honestly. She was a fairly private woman. She might be a little embarrassed by the whole thing. But I'd like to think, I do think, that she'd understand why. That she'd see the 2 years and 4 months and 11 days not as something that broke her daughter, but as something that aimed her. If you are someone who is facing this, with a loved one or yourself, and you feel that specific loneliness, that feeling of, I don't know what I need, but I know I need something. I want you to know that there are people for whom that sentence is the beginning of everything. Reach out to your local hospice. Search for end-of-life doulas in your area through the Good Funeral Guild or the College of Death Care Specialists. You do not have to navigate this alone, and you do not have to pretend that you are fine. And if you are someone who just changes the subject and goes to do the washing up when death comes up at the table, which was me once, which is most of us, I just want to ask you one thing. What if you didn't? What if you stayed in the room just a little longer? What if the conversation you're most afraid of turns out to be the one that matters most? I held my mom's hand when she died, and I didn't know what to do. Now I do. That's enough for me.